Hi, my name is Tom Halley, and I'm going to talk about the sump pumps in the facility and the sump pump controller today. The oil minder, oil spotter sump pump that's in the facility is designed for two purposes. One is to pump out water in the pit when it appears, and it also recognizes when there is oil on top of the water so that it does not pump the oil to the drain in the operation. Let me go through. First of all, I'm going to talk about each of the sump pumps. So there are sump pumps in each of the elevator shafts in the building. Each one is pretty much exactly the same, and as I show you on the diagram here, here's what the sump pumps look like. So the unit that's here is a submersible sump pump. They operate in a 460 volt, and it looks like so the suction is here on the sump pump and the discharge goes out here. Each of them is mounted and with a set of controls that when the water gets to a certain level, it automatically turns on the pump, pumps the water down, and then turns back off. The suction on the sump pumps is on the underside here, and the discharge goes out here. It's a centrifugal impeller that's in there. It's designed for sump pump service, but not for sewage or a vortex style of impeller. So it will pass small solids, but nothing big like a solid that you would see in a sewage system. In case you have an alarm that has a high amp draw, or if you have a high water alarm where the pump is not pumping, the first thing you probably want to do is look at the underside of the sump pump and make sure that there's nothing stuck into the bottom of it, like a plastic bag or some large item that would cover up the bottom of the input to the impeller. Okay. The most important part of this pump system is the controller. So here's what the controller looks like. The enclosure. I'll go through the review of the control panel and how it looks, and then how it operates. It's in a non-metallic enclosure that looks like this. On the top is a red beacon. All the controls are inside, so you'll need to unscrew the screws on the corners of the enclosure to open the control panel and see it. It's also got hasps on the right-hand side of the box. Inside the controller you're going to see this is a simplex controller, so that means there are one pump. Let me slide this over so we can see. All right. There are four major outputs. There's a green light for the power on. There's a green light that will light up when the pump is running. So that will, if the water level gets to the height that turns on the pump, this light will turn on, and then it'll turn off once that pump has turned off. Then you have two alarms. One is the high water alarm that tells you that the water has risen above the on pump level and continued to rise even though the pump was called to come on. And then there's a high oil alarm that tells you that there's a slick of oil on top of the water that has reached a certain depth that it's something you're going to need to look at. And I'm going to show you how those in particular are activated during operation. Here's your pump HOA switch, which you can put in one of three positions. The center position is off, the left is the hand position, and the right is in auto. So if you want to turn a pump on and just run it by hand, you just flip this switch to the hand position. You have to turn it back off. It's not automatically going to turn off when you let go of the switch. So to run a pump, you put it in hand, and to have it operate according to the controls for the floats that are on the control panel, you would put it into the auto position. Okay, these are the fuses for the controller. There are starters and overloads for each for the pump here. Okay. All right, here's the operation of the pump, and I will go through that briefly. So here's your sump that's in the elevator shaft. Here's our pump with our discharge piping, so the water comes in through the pump, goes through the impeller, back out, and out through the discharge pipe out of the sump. This is our control panel that we were just looking at, that's powered, plugged in. And then out of that, we have both the power cord that goes down to the pump, and then we have the float system that goes into the sump for turning the pumps on and off. There's an optional alarm that can be provided with this sump also. So if you have any of the alarms, those alarms can be either a horn or a dry contact to go to another part of the building. So the levels, rather than having float switches for, as you would probably see in a lot of sump pump applications, this particular style of float has a probe, a series of probes that hang down inside the wet well. This probe is attached to the discharge piping, typically by like a muffler clamp style, and it holds the rods at a certain level below in the wet well. So the probes are as follows. First, there's a reference probe. That's the longest probe that's in the sump. That's going to always be hanging at the same level, and any operation in the sump, it's sort of like a ground or a reference for the controller, so that the circuit can be made. The next one up is the stop level. So that tells the sump pump the level at which to stop. So whatever level the bottom of the stop probe is, that's where the off level will be for the sump pump. So as soon as the water breaks from the bottom, so that probe is no longer inside the water, that's when the pump turns off. The next one up is the start probe. So when the water hits the start probe, it makes contact with that probe, the sump pump will turn on. It will pump it down until the water level reaches the stop probe level, and then will turn off. 99% of the time, that's where this sump system will operate, between the start and the stop probe. The next one up is the high water probe, which is, you'll see on there, it's a little bit higher, not very much. It's usually a very small distance between the start and the high water alarm. And if you have the pump fails or something gets stuck in the bottom of the sump pump, the water is going to continue to raise, or if there's a blockage in the discharge pipe that prevents water from leaving the sump, the water will continue to rise as it's coming into the sump, and that when it hits that high water probe, you're going to get a high water alarm. Okay? The last indicator in the sump is the float, and this is designed specifically for the oil application. So if you have oil in a sump, the oil is going to rise to the top. It doesn't mix with water, so the oil floats on top of the water level, always will stay there. These sensors that you see, the probes, those do not register with oil. They only register with water. So what the float does is, this float is designed to trip when the level gets above the start probe by a certain number of inches or millimeters above the water level. So this floats on top of the oil rather than on top of the water. So it's designed so that normally this float would stay in the down position if there's no oil on top of the water. There's equipment in an elevator shaft that has oil in it that could potentially leak into the sump. And so that's why they code requires that you have an oil minder style of sump pump in a pit that prevents the sump pump from pumping oil into the storm drain or into the sewer. So what happens is, if you have a leak of oil from equipment in that area and it accumulates on top of the water, at some point when the water level is going up and approaching the start level for the pump, this float switch floating on top of the oil will actually activate the high oil level and tell you that there's an accumulation of oil on top of the water. Now the start and stop operation of the sump pump will continue to turn the pump on and off. It's just that it turns the pump off before this oil level moves down and gets pulled into the pump. So you'll still be pumping the water off of out of the sump, but the sump pump will typically, because of this stop probe location, will turn the pump off before it starts to pull in oil. And you will not have the float switch on the top. This is like a Mercury style or a snap action float switch that it's only going to turn on when the level of that float goes above horizontal. So there's a switch in there that's designed to stay open when the float switch is hanging in a downward position, and as soon as that float comes up above horizontal, that's when that switch closes and gives us a contact that says there's an accumulation of oil on top of the water. Okay? So it could be that you somewhere along the line have I imagine if you have a sump pump application where the pit gets high enough that the sump pump doesn't start pumping water out, you'll have a high water alarm first, and then you'll probably have, if it continues to go up, you'll also have a high oil level alarm switch that'll give you high oil, even though there may not be any oil in the pit. And that's all dependent on that float switch going in the up position. Okay? So normal operation turns on at low at the stop at the bottom of the stop probe, and if you want to know what level the sump pump turns on and off at, you can either dump some water in there and watch it and take measurements, or you can measure from the top down or from the floor up to the bottom of each one of these probes, the stop probe, the start probe, and the high water probe, and you can give a report that says here's what levels those normally operate at in order to so that you know that it's working. And if you don't like the levels and you want it to turn on a little bit lower, you can adjust the height of this entire assembly up and down on on that pipe or whatever it's attached to change the start and the stop and all the alarm levels. Okay, so anytime you're going to work on this unit with the electrical part of it, of course you want to disconnect the power to it. Make sure that there's not a lot of water coming into the sump while you're working on that, because it'll flood if you're trying to work on it when there's a high influx of water. But always make sure that you remove the power source, disconnect the power, and lock it out before you do any kind of electrical work. And then, of course, any of the alarms, if you have this optional alarm panel, those are going to go also to that level. Okay, that concludes the training on the sump pump. And if you have questions, feel free to call me at Sensio Systems. The number is 610-864-1853. Thank you.